the poem. I have no quarrel with you, but I stand for the clear right to hold my life, my own. The clean, clear right, to mold it as I will, not as you will, with or apart from you. To make of it a thing of brain and blood, of tangible substance and of turbulent thought. No thin gray shadow of the life of man, your love perchance may set a crown upon it, but I may crown myself in other ways, as you have done who are one flesh with me. I have no quarrel with you, but henceforth this you must know. The world is mine, as yours, the pulsing strength and passion and heart of it, the work I set my hand to, women's work, because I set my hand to it.
That's beautiful. Thank you.
So that's a poem that Florence wrote and recited to the House, or the Judiciary Committee of the Legislature in 1916, early 17, I guess it was early 17, and they were up there lobbying for a campaign, a referendum, a statewide referendum on women's suffrage, which Maine had never had before. And I love that poem because I think it just captures the essence of who Florence was. She was a writer and an artist. She was a suffrage activist. She was also a peace activist. She did a lot of things across her life. She was a devoted wife and mother, a deeply spiritual person. And she was all these things that she chose to be. And at a time when society kind of offered women life's crumbs, she demanded a seat at the table and a menu of her own. So she didn't like narrow societal expectations. She is the subject of my book, which is here today, and you're welcome to purchase a copy at the end. I'm proud to say that she was my great-grandmother. I hope that you'll adopt her as one of your own. She was born and grew up in Augusta. I'll talk a little bit more about her childhood in a minute. But to me, she really is a Maine treasure. And I was super happy that we were able to get her inducted into the Maine Women's Hall of Fame in 2008 in recognition of her contributions to women's civic and social equality. But this was history that my own family didn't remember or value particularly, or didn't value enough to remember, maybe that's the right way to put it. And so I had to do a lot of research to find out about her, and it took me really 15 years of working off and on to figure this out. I started with papers that my aunt had donated to the Maine Historical Society. They were Florence's papers that she'd left, but I also looked at all the papers in Portland and also the Kennebec Journal and the Lewiston Journal from about 1914 to 1920. I looked at those on microfilm. The Library of Congress has the archives of the two national suffrage organizations, the National Women's Party and the National American Women's Suffrage Association, and they had a lot of her correspondence, so I looked through all that stuff during the time she was active, and also the University of Maine, Orono, and the State Archive. So I really did extensive research to piece together this history, and of course I didn't know anything about suffrage history, so I had to do a lot of background reading as well. So that's how I came to this story, and I'm going to start by talking a little bit about her childhood. So this is a picture. This is actually her National Women's Party, formal photo that she took for them, and that they used in the articles they wrote about her. But she was born and brought up in Augusta, as I said. This is the house at 7 Spruce Street. Her dad was a successful businessman. He had a hardware store on Water Street in Augusta, and there were 5 kids in the family. She was the 4th and the first girl, but he seemed to have made enough money to keep them in relative comfort. That's her dad, Samuel Spencer Brooks. This is her mother, Mary Caroline Wadsworth Brooks, and she was somehow connected to the Henry Wadsworth Longfellow family, but somewhat distantly. So Florence, you can see she has on the right there, she has these sort of intense eyes, and I think they were blue. She was kind of brown haired, but had these bright blue eyes. So when I recite her poem, I like to think of her staring at the men in the Judiciary Committee with this intense gaze. That, on the left is her sister Daisy, that she was very close to throughout her life, her younger sister. The family was one of the first families to buy into Squirrel Island. I don't know if there are any Squirrel Islanders here, but this is sort of a funny photo. I like this because that's her brother Percy, who looks like he's kind of strangling her, but in fact what he's doing is grabbing by her chin and trying to get her head cranked around to look at the camera, I think. Next to her is her husband, Robert Whitehouse, and I don't know who the mutton chop sleeve woman is. I've never figured that out, but that's a great dress, isn't it? And I love this picture because we tend to think of our leaders as these very staid, formal people, but here she is. She's in her early 20s. Her life is still in large part before her. And here's another shot of her with her husband Robert. And he also grew up in Augusta. They went to the public schools there. His dad was on the Supreme Court, the Maine Supreme Court, and was Chief Justice of the Maine Supreme Court for a number of years. And so I think she must have known him from childhood. She could have gone to college, I think. She went to a finishing school in Augusta, affiliated with the Episcopal Church. And she could have gone to college, and certainly her dad could have afforded to send her, but I think she was just way too independent. What she really loved was music, and so she had a fine soprano voice, evidently, and art, and languages. And so she went to Boston instead and spent several winters in Boston just studying with various masters there. And then in the early 1890s, she took an extended trip abroad to all over Europe and Syria, the Middle East. I think she was alone much of that time. She did hook up one winter with a McCormick family whose ancestor had invented the reaper. And they were quite well off, and they had their own boat, so they went up and down the Nile all this winter. And somehow she got connected with them. And the family story is that Robert thought it was time for her to come home and sailed for Egypt or someplace to bring her back. But I've never been able to find any evidence of that, but it is kind of a fun story. So they did marry in 1894 and moved to Portland, where they lived for the rest of their lives. His mother helped them buy a house on Deering Street, which is in the Parkside neighborhood now. And they had a blast when they first moved to Portland. Of course, they don't have any kids yet, and one of the things they really liked to do was write plays and perform in them, and direct them and perform in them. And they would put these plays on for charity. They did it in what's now Merrill Hall, but all the way up the coast, and of course on Squirrel in the summers. And but then he was in private practice at first. Later on, he became the district attorney for Cumberland County. And so he got pretty busy, and then the kids started coming up as they do. And so these are the three kids that they had. William Penn is the eldest, he's on the lower right, and then Robert Treat, named for his dad, and then my grandfather was Brooks. He's the little one in the back. But in the meantime, during this period, she found the time somehow to write her first novel, which was The God of Things. It was kind of a romance of the Sudan, as how it was sort of promoted. And she actually did these fine pencil drawings and illustrated the book. She adapted it from one of the plays that they'd written. And so this one, she got Little Brown and Company to publish it, and was promoted coast to coast and pretty well received. And then she got to work adapting one of her other plays for a novel, and finished that one up when she was on bed rest, actually pregnant with my grandfather. And so because she had a lot going on in her life at that point, they got somebody else to illustrate that one. But I think, so they were having, sort of a typical young family here in Portland, very busy. She did have her own career, though, at a time when that was pretty unusual. And of course, I remember saying to my mom once, how on earth did she do all those things? I mean, I was just struggling to survive with our two kids and a business. And she said, oh, my dear, she had help. No, help, that I didn't have. And so, yeah, I think she had certainly there was a nanny, and there may have been a housekeeper or a cook or something. So that made a big difference. And so everything was going great until my grandfather Brooks was 4 years old, and then he got polio in 1908, and it was just devastating. Of course, he was in an iron lung for a while. He was very sick, and the doctors didn't think he would ever walk again, and she refused to believe that, and she just dropped everything and nursed him. She apparently used to massage his legs, you know, and there was some sort of water therapy that was new, and whether it was her administrations or what, he eventually did, you know, get movement again in his legs, and eventually was able to lead a pretty active life. He played tennis, he went hunting, he was, you know, he got around pretty well. So I have a scrapbook of hers, and it just ends in 1908, and then it picks up again around the time she gets started in suffrage, and I think this is around that time. And the circumstances of her getting involved in suffrage were that she had subscribed to these lectures that Mrs. Hamlin was giving at the Congress Square Hotel in the music room, and it was Mrs. Hamlin would talk about all these esoteric, you know, subjects like trade with South America or food safety, and this one night it was about suffrage, and unbelievably, even though she traveled around making money off of these lectures, Mrs. Hamlin was opposed to women's suffrage. And so Florence is sitting there in the audience thinking, well, this is nuts. I mean, I've written 2 novels, and I've done all these things. I've traveled around the world. I'm well educated. Why can't I vote? But she said to Mrs. Hamlin, I don't have the arguments at the tip of my tongue, but I'll tell you what, I'm going to go away and research this for 6 months, and then I'll come back and debate you. And so that's what happened. That's what got her started in suffrage. And it's, let's see if I can find this. She later said that she dropped everything else. She had been pretty involved in Portland's progressive movement, but she ended up dropping everything just to devote herself to suffrage. And the reason, she said, was that it was you know, so much more worth it to do that than to spend time on social work, because it got at the root causes of why women, you know, were forced into prostitution because they didn't have any other way to earn a living, for example, or you know, kids went hungry, or men went off and drank up all their earnings. And so she was very focused on this, with some exceptions. We'll get into those a little later. So I'm going to get into a brief history of suffrage. If you don't know this history, it's just helpful to know this. So the National American Women's Suffrage Association, or NASA, was the preeminent national organization, and it was, you know, it was the sort of legacy one. It had been around for decades in one shape or form, and they favored a state-by-state approach. Famously, although they claimed to be promoting the idea of an amendment to the U.S. Constitution, I think in 1912, the woman who had that role for them had a budget of $20 and returned change at the end of the year. So clearly not a big focus for them. And they were non-confrontational, non-political, incremental progress was fine. And so because we tend not to know who our famous leaders are, I'd like to show their faces. Anna Howard Shaw was the president up till 1915, and then Terry Chapman Catt took over. Catt had actually been president before, but came back in for the remaining years of the fight. And so Florence joined their Maine affiliate, which was the Maine Women's Suffrage Association, and quickly became their rising star because, you know, she could write, she was comfortable on stage, she was a great debater, she was affluent enough so she could devote a lot of time to it. She was very well connected socially and politically, so they were psyched about her because a lot of these women, you know, in the Maine movement too, looked like this. I mean, they've been doing this for a lot of years, and they needed some young blood. She was in her early 40s, so she was not just out of college or anything, but she had a lot of experience, and so they were kind of grooming her to take over. But then something else happened, and some young women came along and started the Congressional Union, which became the National Women's Party, and for them, the federal amendment to the Constitution was the sole focus. None of this incremental stuff. They wanted suffrage now. They were going to use very controversial methods like picketing in order to get their point across. And significantly, because there had been a bunch of successful state campaigns, and NASA hadn't been completely, unsuccessful in what they'd done, and there were now 4 million women all west of the Mississippi who had the right to vote, and they were going to use the power of that vote. They were going to harness for the first time ever women voting as a bloc to vote against the party in power if they failed to advance the measure through Congress. And this was very controversial. NASA hated the idea. And these are the two women who started this organization. It was Alice Paul and Lucy Burns. And when you think about it in our terms today, I mean, which of these women would be more likely to use a social media strategy, for example? I mean, they just had different methods. I mean, movements evolve and strategies evolve with them. So here's just a quick recap of them, of the two. Sometimes people have trouble keeping them straight. So here's another press photo for what became the National Women's Party. It was a congressional union. So Florence joined them in summer of 1915. Florence Kelly, who was another famous suffragist and labor activist, came to Maine recruiting members who were trying to set up a local Maine chapter, and Florence ended up selecting her to be the chair. And so she remained as chair of the Maine branch of the National Women's Party into the 1930s, and so she was active on the ERA when they later got working on that. And it created this very difficult tension for her because NASA and the Maine Women's Suffrage Association, more conservative, they didn't like these people. They didn't like Alice Paul and the Congressional Union at all. But they couldn't afford to lose Florence because she was their most effective suffragist. And so they were kind of, trying to appease her and kind of go along with it, but they weren't happy about her work with the Congressional Union. She was kind of like, well, look, with the Congressional Union, I'll work on the federal stuff, and with you guys, I'll work on the state stuff. Trust me, it'll be fine. But it wasn't fine because in 1916, when they knew that they'd already decided that they knew they had the votes, because she was chair of the legislative committee for MISA. They knew they had the votes for a statewide referendum in 1917. So, but in the fall of 1916, President Wilson's up for re-election, and the Congressional Union's going after him. He's campaigning under the slogan, he kept us out of war. They're going after him under the slogan, he kept us out of suffrage. So they're holding him accountable for not supporting the suffrage movement. So Alice Paul hires her to go out to Wyoming and campaign against him there, because of course Wyoming's an equal suffrage state. On the way, she stops in Chicago and participates in this demonstration against Wilson, who happens to be in town to deliver an important public policy speech. And so she and this other woman over here, Mrs. Bertram Sippy, who was the chair of the Illinois branch of the Congressional Union, led this whole parade of women down the street from their headquarters and lined up along this block. And I don't know if you could read it, but her sign says, "Why does Wilson seek votes from women when he opposes votes for women?" And so they're all lined up. This is actually only half the photo. They're all lined up along this block. And Wilson comes up, gets out of his carriage, goes into the hall where he's going to give a speech, and all of a sudden this mob, and I don't know, you can't probably see them, but there are a bunch of men behind them, and this mob has slowly been closing in around them, and as soon as Wilson goes into the hall, they attack. And they grab the signs, and they try to pull them out of the women's hands. They resist, they get thrown to the ground, the signs get broken and trashed, and it's just a complete melee on the streets of Chicago. And my dear, respectable middle-class women do not have brawls on the streets, of any city. And then they ended up the mob chases them back to headquarters and stands around outside and, hurls epithets at them for hours. And of course the Congressional Union, this is exactly what they want to see happen, right? This is front page news across the country. And Florence has her own suffrage column in the Lewiston Journal. She makes sure she writes a letter back to the LJ about this experience and how great it was. And of course, her fellow suffragists back in Maine are like, "Are you kidding me? What are you doing? You're going to just screw this whole thing up." So she goes on to Wyoming, she does her thing, spends about 2 weeks out there and comes back to Maine. Of course, Wilson was reelected because people were very concerned about peace. But they did make some inroads into his margin, and they were able to defeat some congressmen along the way, so they felt like it was a major victory. So she comes back to Maine, and they tell her, you know, you can link stamps, but you can't have any public role in this upcoming suffrage referendum because you're just way too controversial. So she was trying to figure out what to do about that, and then a bunch of her friends didn't like the way Misa was treating her, and decided to create a third suffrage organization, which they called the Equal Suffrage Referendum League. And they did this in secret, and they voted her to be the president, and then they came to her house and told her what they'd done, and asked her if she'd serve, and she said, yes, of course. So that was how she got to work on the suffrage referendum in 1917. So in February of 1917, the legislature did go ahead and pass the referendum, and set a date of September 10th. So, but it was a really long, cold, snowy winter. They couldn't get out. You know, then there was a wet spring, so they couldn't get out to the rural areas. They really couldn't get started on organizing until well into the spring. And of course, by that time, the U.S. had entered World War I. And instantly, just overnight, you know, there was this pivot and this massive surge of patriotism. And women who had promised they would spend every nickel and every spare hour on the suffrage referendum just went to work for the war. And including Florence, actually, whose two older sons actually enlisted in the sort of fledgling Air Force. And so she joined the Red Cross and became head of their information bureau in Portland. And you know, think about it, there was no VA in those days, and there was no way to communicate for troops and their families. So if somebody was killed or injured, their family, you know, there was nobody to help figure out how to deal with benefits or anything like that. That was the role that her committee ended up taking. As in the early stages, it was all publicity about war bonds and things like that. But in later months, once they were well into the war, that's the role they took over. So, you know, suffrage organizing took a back seat. And it wasn't until the summer that they really started going again. And at this point, the other thing that had happened was that the picketing had started in D.C. Alice Paul and her bunch had started picketing the White House. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But these are some of the posters that Florence's new Equal Suffrage Referendum League put together. They had an office at 662 Congress Street, had some nice bow windows in it. So they would, she had a friend who did these drawings for them, these cartoons, and they'd post these they print them in the newspapers, but then post them in their office windows. So this one is, you know, the yes vote for suffrage is the Grange, the Federation of Labor and Good Government, and prejudice, vice, and the high cost of living are reasons we would vote against it. So choose your side and everybody's full. So that's kind of, here's another one, another couple. A little harder to read these, but there a lot of, you know, a lot of women who didn't support suffrage tended to be higher income, more affluent people. So this woman on the left is saying, I know nothing about the price of eggs, you know. And here on the right is hugging a delusion that women should be clinging vines. And the war effort made clear that women were just integral to winning the war, and that was a delusion that had to go by the wayside. So, you know, she worked so hard. I mean, she was out canvassing door to door, she was organizing speakers, and she tried to work really collaboratively with Misa, but they were really furious about this picketing. So it started out kind of innocently enough. They had, these are the tri-colored banners of the colors of the National Women's Party, which were purple, white, and gold. And they would just stand silently next to the White House gates, which of course you could do in those days because it was not the bunker that it is now. They could actually see Wilson driving in and out on his way to golf or something. But in the summer, things got a little bit more, you know, yes, they got more pointed, I guess you could say, in their comments about Wilson. And here, I mean, you just can't really understand. It's a bit like the Russians in the Cold War. You know, to compare President Wilson to the German Kaiser in World War I was just, you know, insane. And everybody was angry with them for this. But their point was well taken. You know, we're in this war that's going to make the world safe for democracy, but 20 million women at home are disenfranchised. You know, so take the beam out of your own eye. You know, it's kind of a nasty thing to say to Wilson. And so starting in June, the picketing started in January, but by June, after the U.S. entered the war, mobs were attacking the women on a daily basis, and they were getting hauled off to jail. You know, Alice Paul went on hunger strikes. She was force-fed, and Rose Winslow is another person who was force-fed. And they were kept in these wretched conditions. And all of this was going on without a murmur of protest from the mainstream suffrage organization, which is kind of crazy in some ways. And Florence was really the lone voice in Maine who spoke out against this. And she was under considerable pressure in 1917 to denounce them and to relinquish her role as chair of the Congressional Union, but she refused. And so in the end, the suffrage referendum was defeated 2-1, and Congressman Hersey, in this headline, says, you know, the women are amazing, but they defeated suffrage in Maine, because of course anytime they got arrested in DC, you know, the Congressional Union made sure they got publicity for it, and so people in Maine were very conservative and very disapproving of this behavior, especially during the war. So, of course, the one woman who's defending the pickets in DC is Florence, and so everybody's looking at her. She and Robert took a quick trip out of town right after the suffrage referendum vote to kind of heal up, but she got right back into it. So that the Congressional Union had created initially a separate National Women's Party, but they ended up sort of merging under this one banner. So that became the National Women's Party after about 1917. And I don't know if you can read the tagline here, but it says, "A fair exchange is no robbery." And basically the idea is that it's perfectly acceptable and normal for women to expect that they should, you know, that in exchange for their vote or their support for a candidate, that they should get some support for their measures. And so by this time, she and Robert had moved to 108 Bond Street in the west end of Portland, and that is the main headquarters of the National Women's Party, and remained that into the 20s. So there's a lot of work that went on in 1918. They're making progress in Congress. And at this point, I should say, Florence is just working exclusively for the National Women's Party. She's not doing any work with me, so they basically forced her out after the suffrage referendum, which was fine with her. And so they're making progress in DC, and Maine has this one senator, Frederick Hale, who's they think is supportive of suffrage, but he had made a pledge to Florence during the referendum campaign that if he would abide by the will of the state, and if they passed it, he would vote for it in the Senate, and if they opposed it, then he would vote against it. And he felt as though he was honor bound to, you know, to stick by that, even though Florence told him that she would let him go back on his promise to her. But because he was on this short list of senators nationally who they thought they could turn, there was enormous pressure on Maine to turn him. And so there was all these letter writing campaigns, and Florence was really in the forefront of all of that. They were never able to do it, though. He ended up voting against it, and then when it passed in the Senate, he went back and changed his vote, so it would look like he voted for it, but it was it wasn't a decisive vote when it could have been. He was weaselly. So you can't really see this, but this is a telegram that Florence sent to Alice Paul after it finally cleared the House and Senate in June of 1919. And it says, "Congratulations and rejoicing. Suffrage victory is due to you and your undaunted fate, splendid vision, and untiring devotion to the cause. I'm proud to be the lowliest of your disciples." So she had a funny relationship with Alice Paul, who in all of Alice Paul's correspondence, she's always very formal, very professional, very businesslike. You almost never ever see her rant about anybody, even when she had reason to. And most people responded in kind, but Florence was old enough to be her mother, and I think she felt, she wrote her very playfully and very much as a kind of a peer, a friend. So anyway, they had an interesting relationship. But of course they weren't done then. They still had to get it ratified. 3/4 of the states had to ratify it, and that sort of brings in this whole other campaign, because a lot of states then met only every other year, and a lot of them had met in 1919 already. So they had to get, a lot of states had to get special sessions called by the governor. If the governor was opposed, it was hard to get that done. It was after the war, everybody was feeling penny pinched. They didn't want to they didn't want to spend the money. But Governor Carl Milliken in Maine was fortunately a suffrage supporter, and so Florence worked really closely with him to make sure that the legislature met in November of 1919 and voted on it. And there was a lot of drama, and you can read about it in the book, but I mean, in the end, it was Florence and Alice Paul who because they were about to lose the vote, and they got some of the legislative leaders in a back room at the Capitol here in Augusta, and twisted arms. I don't know what they said to them, but they managed to get them to publish something in the newspapers to support the suffrage vote, and they passed it easily in the House, I think, but it only cleared by 4 votes in the Senate, so they were, definitely their intervention was needed. So here's the signing ceremony of the ratification vote. Maine was the 19th state to ratify the 19th Amendment, and so Florence is standing directly behind the governor, and that's Grace Hill next to her. And to her, then it goes Mabel Connor, who was the MISA president at that time, Catherine Reed Ballantyne, who was Thomas Reed's, who was House Speaker Thomas Reed's, that's his daughter, Catherine Reed Ballantyne, and Gertrude Pattengull, and then Anne Gannett, who was Guy Gannett's wife. And so what's interesting to me about this photo is that he's using this purple, white, and gold pen that the Congressional Union had gotten made up and sent around to all the states for these signing ceremonies. And I'm not sure if every state was willing to use it, but in Maine, Governor Milliken did. And in doing so, it seems to me that he's clearly showing his support for the Congressional, or the National Women's Party, and what they did to get this vote won. And after, you can see on the table there are these sort of souvenir pens, and all the other women got these sort of steel pens, but he gave Florence a pearl-handled gold pen, which I think was a nod to maybe a little bit her outlaw ways. So there was a lot of other shenanigans after that. I mean, the antis tried to overturn the vote. There was a lot of effort nationally to say that the only way you could ratify an amendment to the Constitution was through a statewide referendum, which of course is not the way our Constitution is written. So the courts correctly, refused to honor that. So they weren't done even then. They had to sort of pay attention to make sure that things went through the courts all right. But so here they are on State Street in Portland. It says votes for women a success. I'm not actually sure this is right after the vote was won, but I think so, because I think it shows that Maine is in black, which would make it I don't know. I'm not sure, actually. I think this might be at some other time, but I love the photo. And there's Florence, and I don't know some of the other, I think that's her buddy Grace Hill in the back seat there, and Louise Freeman to her right. So, there's this whole line of automobiles that's going up State Street there. It's sort of fun to see State Street, a dirt road then. So the 19th Amendment, this is the language of the 19th Amendment that took them 72 years from the 1848 Seneca Falls Convention to get through Congress. I mean, they didn't introduce it right away. It was something Susan B. Anthony did later. But I mean, the inability of women to vote was flagged in the 1848 Seneca Falls Convention. And just, people don't always know, but the National American Women's Suffrage Association became the League of Women Voters. They set that up so as soon as the last state ratified, the national organization and the state affiliates all became leagues. And the Maine Women's Suffrage Association, of course, became the Maine League of Women Voters. Then the National Women's Party didn't need to change its name because it didn't refer to suffrage, so but it sponsored the Equal Rights Amendment. That was sponsored in Alice Paul. They took a few years to sort of regroup, and I think Alice Paul actually went and got a law degree, and then they came up with this language for the Equal Rights Amendment. Again, very similar to the 19th Amendment. People don't always know this, but this is the Equal Rights Amendment, the ERA, which was never ratified. We're now just 2 states short because Nevada, crazily, ratified it last March, a year ago this month. So now we're just 2 states short. There's a lot of drama about that because Congress, when they originally authorized or passed the Equal Rights Amendment, set a deadline of 7 years for the women. The only constitutional amendment where there's ever been a deadline, by the way, and said you have 7 years to get this ratified. And so the women went off and they fell short. The country was becoming more conservative, and so they went back to Congress and got 3 more years. And at the end of it, they were still 3 states short. So the women kind of gave up at that point. You know, Reagan got elected, and things were getting more conservative. But so in the 90s, though, this one amendment to the Constitution that has to do with, I think, congressional pay, which had first been introduced, if it had passed, it would have been like the 11th Amendment to the Constitution. Suddenly, the last state needed to ratify that, ratified it. So it suddenly became the law of the land, and that was from, I don't know, like 1800 or something, in the late 1790s. And the women were like, are you kidding me? You gave us 10 years, and this one comes in? So they said, okay, forget about it. And you know, we're going to go after, we're not going to start from scratch. We're just going to go after those last 3 states. So I believe Virginia just refused to ratify, and now everybody's looking at Illinois and hoping that Illinois will. And so no one knows what will happen if we get 2 more states, because it has to get back to Congress. But one thing everybody seems pretty sure about is that no state can unratify. Like a bunch of states have said, you know, that have gotten more conservative have said, oh no, we're going to just roll back, we'll just, you know, withdraw our ratification. But apparently we can't do that. Well, so there'll be a fight, but it's kind of exciting. In the meantime, by the way, Maine, they try to get states to just bring this language into their state constitutions, and Maine has never done that. Maine did ratify the national ERA. We have never passed a statewide ERA. And one of the reasons why, well, one of many reasons I'm running for state rep is that the incumbent she's a woman, but she's a Republican, and she has voted repeatedly against the Maine Equal Rights Amendment. And it's a party line vote, by the way. The Republicans all vote against it, the Democrats all vote for it. It's completely ridiculous. So it's important to remember that the only constitutionally protected right that women have is the right to vote. Everything else that we've won has been won through, you know, statute or regulation, and those things can be taken away quite easily. So, you know, those flyers over there are part of an effort that some friends and I have put together to get into high schools and sort of bring high schoolers up to speed on this history, because I think it's really hard to understand the strength and the importance of women's claims for equal rights if you don't know this history. And and that they need to be working on the Equal Rights Amendment. We kind of passed the baton to them a little bit. Back to Florence. After suffrage was won, she did stay involved with the National Women's Party and the Equal Rights Amendment. But Robert became ill and died in 1924, which really was hard for her, and she had to take some time out for a while. And then, you know, they had to sell the house on Bond Street. She moved in with her son out in Falmouth, but then they lost that house too. You know, the Depression hit. She ended up living in her son's law offices, which were on the top floor of the building above the State Street Theater on Congress Street in Portland. And she was always really good-humored about it. She like her bedroom was a supply room, and her living room was his conference room. But she always said that she loved to go to the movies, and now she could go in whenever she wanted. So in 1930, she did take a cross-country road trip with her buddy Grace Hill. They drove to Sacramento, leaving Maine on January 1st and driving for several months. And Florence drove the whole way because Grace didn't drive, except for this one section through the desert when it was straight and flat enough that Grace could take the wheel. She went back to painting. She tried to write a third novel, which wasn't accepted. And I read it. It wasn't great, honestly, but she got weirdly sort of religious in her later life, and people didn't like that. So here's another. She liked painting on Monhegan. So these are two of her Monhegan paintings. You know, if I knew her today, I would think she was a pretty cool person, but against the backdrop of her own place and time, she's quite remarkable. And she lived a life of conscience and a principle in the face sometimes of considerable opposition and hostility even. So, you know, when I first sort of met her through her writings and the research that I did, I was really attracted by her suffrage activism, and that just was such cool history. But I later realized that she was so much more than just that period of her life. And to me, she gives women permission to be successful in many spheres, and in fact, by her example, kind of challenges us to do that. But most importantly, she reminds us that the work we do is women's work because we choose to set our hands to it, and not because somebody else defines it for us. So that concludes my remarks. I'd be happy to take some questions. Yeah.
And I'm guessing, so I want to ask you, did her husband and her sons support her in her efforts?
Yes, you know, thank you so much for asking that question. I need to add a slide that shows that, in fact, that did happen. He in, I think, 1914, helped found and was chair of something called the Men's Equal Suffrage League. And it was a model. New York State had one of these as well, and when you look at the board that they put together for the Men's Equal Suffrage League, it was full of Maine's rising political stars, you know, future governors, future senators, future congressmen, but they made him chair it. He didn't want it, but he was very supportive. In fact, during the 1917 suffrage referendum, they put $1,000 of their own money into that suffrage fight because it was so hard to fundraise. Especially with a sort of third-party organization, and that translates into over $20,000 in today's money. It was a lot of money. And the one thing that he didn't want, though, was he just, for whatever reason, he couldn't stomach the idea of her getting arrested or jailed. And so he refused to allow her to join the picket line, although the correspondence from DC is just steady. Please come help us picket. Please, you know, there are so few women who are courageous enough to do this. Please picket. And she would go right back to them and say, "You haven't persuaded Robert. You know, he's supported me in other ways. I just feel I can't go against him in this one place." So she did end up going down at one point. I think it was in around 1918 to picket, and it was after her second son went off to war, and she was just really furious. But it was. They generally knew when they were likely to get arrested, depending on what they had in mind. I mean, like burning the president in effigy, yep, you're going to get arrested, plan on it, you know. Just holding some more innocuous signs, probably not. So, or, you know, if there were, you know, several hundred women there, they'd be less likely to get arrested. So she did go down a couple times, but yeah.
I just want to say, and I'm so sorry more people couldn't get out. This has been really, really interesting and beautifully presented.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you. And this is slightly tangential, but I missed what you're involved in now at the State Museum. What is that? Can you just speak to that for a minute?
Yeah, so Maine ratified in 1919, but it didn't get, the whole measure didn't get finally ratified until 2020. So the 100-year anniversary of the federal amendment is 2020, but it's also Maine's, I think it's our bicentennial. I can never quite remember this. So there's going to be a big celebration around Maine's, bicentennial at the Maine State Museum. And so what they've done is to move the suffrage celebration to 2019, or the suffrage exhibit to 2019, honoring Maine's ratification of the amendment and not its ratification nationally. So there's a good-sized room in the museum that they'll use. I just heard last month that they actually are going to go ahead with it. We're having difficulty finding artifacts from that suffrage period. I mean, I have a ton of material, of course. I mean, I have literally 5 3-ring binders that I gave, just lent them so that they could see what I did, the research I did. But and I think it'll be based somewhat on that. But they want to go back in history as well. And so yeah, I don't exactly know what they have in mind, but we'll see.
Thanks.
Yeah. Did you have a question?
I did. What is the argument that the 2 states use against ratification?
Of the ERA?
Yes.
Women don't need it. I mean, that's basically what it comes down to. Back in the 70s, when Phyllis Schlafly was around, they were, you can remember some of those arguments. I mean, there'll be co-ed bathrooms. That's what I remember. So there'll be co-ed bathrooms. Women will have to go into the military. It'll be gay, there'll be gay marriage, it's all these things that have happened anyway, regardless of the Equal Rights Amendment. But the fundamental, I was up in Augusta last spring when it came up for a vote again, and I came and testified for it, and there was this, I swear to God, it was like a Phyllis Schlafly clone there in her little hat and outfit standing there saying, no, we don't need suffrage. I mean, we don't need equal rights. We're fine. We have plenty of equal rights as it is. So, and I think it's really, I just don't understand it myself. I don't understand why women were opposed to the right to vote 100 years ago, I don't get it. Yeah.
My legislator voted against it.
Yeah.
And she's a woman, and I was at the State House and talked to her about it, and she had the same argument that we don't need it. And I gave her a whole list of reasons why we needed it. And she emailed me back after I gave her the list and said she still didn't understand why we needed it. And I asked her, did you actually read what I gave you? And she got really testy.
Yeah.
She got really angry with me.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I went and found my legislator in the committee room. She sits on Elkred, and they actually had a break, so I went right up to her and said, Sue, you have grandchildren. Why wouldn't you want your granddaughter to have the same rights as your grandsons on the day she's born? And she just looked at me, and she was just, she's not the sharpest tool in the shed, I have to say. I'm not the only person who says that. And but she just looked at me, and she was very confused. And she votes as she's told.
Unbelievable.
Yeah, it is. I'm sorry, your question?
Yeah, what was, after the 19th Amendment was passed, what was the first national election that women were able to vote in? And part of that would be, was it seen as a significant change in the voting pattern? Did it affect the outcome?
Question. Yeah, it was 1920, so they were able to vote in time for, they got it ratified in August of 2020, so they were, 1920, I forget what century I'm in sometimes, 1920, so they were able to vote in that year's presidential election. And it's an interesting question because one of the arguments that they made was all along was that women, they're much purer than men, they're much more moral. We need their vote, their moral guidance in making the laws of this country. And so there was a lot of expectation that, first of all, women would vote in large numbers and that it would have a huge effect on the outcome. And in fact, you know, that didn't happen. They didn't, it wasn't overwhelmingly large numbers, you know, of women that voted. And it didn't really change a whole lot. And I don't really, I've never seen a good analysis of why that's so. What I think is that they were exhausted. You know, a lot of these women had worked so hard for so many years to pass suffrage in their states or at the national level. They were sick of it. They were ready to move on to other causes, and those causes have been neglected. They weren't sort of ready to tee up and bring up for legislation. And then, of course, it was the roaring 20s, you know, it was the post-war, roaring 20s. People were into having fun. Then we hit the 30s and the Depression, and then we hit World War II. And then, you know, and the women got you know, grabbed out of the factories, or out of the homes to go work in the factories in World War II. But then there was this whole publicity campaign to get them back into the homes when the men came back from war and needed those jobs back. And then, so the 50s were the result of that publicity campaign. You know, so it wasn't until the 60s that we started sort of remembering this history and getting active again. But so, I mean, I'm pretty determined not to go back to the 50s. That's a pretty scary decade in my view. So that's one of the reasons why we're doing these women's history talks. But yeah, it's interesting. It's an interesting question. And I don't know. You know, it's just like any other voting bloc. I mean, it's pretty hard to get a bunch of different people, even if they're the same sex or the same race, to vote in lockstep. It didn't happen, yeah.
Is there any hope that the women will come out and vote in greater numbers in November or in 2020?
You know, it's hard to say. I'd like to think so, but of course, you know, we need some of those conservative, evangelical white women to stay home if they're not going to vote the right way. I mean, they're the ones who supported Trump in large numbers. But I think, yes, I think there will be. I mean, the evidence is from just some of the special elections around the country that a lot of people are pissed off and they're coming out to vote. So
Well, I think it's great that there's so many women candidates
yeah.
that are going to run. I think that's
26,000
wonderful.
or something, just Emily's list alone, yeah. That is good news. You know, there was an article in the Guardian newspaper just in December talking about the benefits that Iceland has realized from having women leaders. And, you know, they have much better child care. And this is a country of 300,000 people. I mean, it's not like, you know, and it's a pretty big country, you know, and they don't have a lot of, people to pay for infrastructure, not a lot of industry there, but they have much better child care, much, more family-friendly policies, and they attribute that to having women as leaders, and same with some of the Scandinavian countries in Europe. So I think, I'm wary of over-promising because of the experience of 100 years ago, of women purifying politics in some way, or magically making everything better. But it's got to help, because one of the pictures when we're in the high schools, one of the pictures we show the kids is from President Trump signing the executive order that reinstates the gag rule, the much more conservative gag rule that prevents any federal funding internationally from going to any organization that even refers a woman to an organization that offers abortion. I mean, we're not even talking about funding abortions. It's just like even referrals or information about abortion excludes you from U.S. funding internationally. So he's like furiously scribbling, and signing this gag rule. And then there's this other photo of the Republican caucus in the House, all white men, talking about health care, in which they're planning to eliminate birth control, or funding for birth control. And it's just like, okay, this is what we're talking about here, So it's got to help to have some women in the room. That's all I think. Yeah.
How are you finding when you're seeing some kids now? I mean, what are they feeling about what you have to say? Do they actually hear what you are saying? Because you had, said something about seeing kids now, in schools.
Yeah, I think they are. It depends. Like first period, they're all asleep. They never ask questions in first period. In later periods, a lot of them do. They'll ask questions like you've asked, why did women not want the vote? What were the arguments against it? But they're paying attention and nodding. And one of the nice things is that the women that I do these discussions with are older and can talk about growing up in the 40s and 50s. And this one woman talks about her aunt who during the World War II was promoted to be a buyer for J.C. Penney because the man went off to war, but when he came back, she got demoted back to the secretarial pool. And she comes home from school and her aunt is crying in her grandmother's kitchen about this. Or when she was growing up, she and her mother always rode in the back seat of the car when they went out for the Sunday drives, and her younger brother, and her dad rode in the front seat. Those are such powerful stories and images for the kids, and they'd start, you can see them, they're looking at each other like, what, that happened? And so, yeah, I think they're listening. We show them those photos of Trump, and I ask them, hey, is anybody here ever planning to have sex? And they're just like, sometimes some goofy guy will but I was like, I don't expect a show of hands, but some of you may not have health insurance, and you may need to go to Planned Parenthood for birth control. Statistically, 20% of you would be parents already, if you didn't have access to birth control. These folks are trying to take that away from you, just pay attention. And I can get away with, I don't know if I'll get invited back, but I can say stuff like that. So, yeah, I think they're listening. I hope so. Back there?
With Trump or the president, any president, being able to do executive orders, what other regulations do you see potentially being eliminated that do allow women to hold positions or run for office or be a part of society over and beyond what they were back in the 20s and 30s?
Yeah. That's an interesting question. I think, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, I think, was one of the ones that Martha Griffiths, who was a representative, was the one who managed to get that injected into sex into that law. And she was almost laughed off the floor when she...
From Michigan.
Yes, she's from Michigan. Yeah, and Dorothy knows her. Dorothy Farrell's a mutual friend that knows her, actually was her mentor. And so, that has been very effective. That has given, women some standing for complaints and bringing suits and things like that. I think that Roe v. Wade is at real risk, and that there could be other things that the Supreme Court, turns back the clock on. I haven't heard of any cases, but abortion rights is an obvious one. I think the more likely, it depends on what these midterm elections, what happens with these as well. I think it's likely, at the very least, the Republicans and the numbers in the House and the Senate will be eroded. So it'll be harder for them to pass anti-woman legislation. But I think the more likely, what we'll see is what they're doing, like at the EPA or things like that. They just don't enforce regulations that are on the books, and they don't, or they sort of quietly try to change them. But I think Roe v. Wade is the big one I'm waiting for. Yeah.
How do you set up getting into the schools? How is that?
Yeah, it's cumbersome actually. If anybody's got a better suggestion, I'm open to it. I tried to go in through the State Department of Education, but they didn't want to have any part of it. So what I do is I figure out where I can get to or get my people to. Some of them are in their 80s. It's I don't want them driving all over the state, especially in the winter. But I go to a school and I look at their website and I find the teachers who teach social studies or history, and I email them in a blog, and I send the flyer and some background narrative, and then if I don't hear from them, I just keep bugging them, and usually, sometimes somebody will bite. But it's funny. We've been to Deering and Portland High School in Portland, and Falmouth High School, Gore Middle School, Lewiston High School, and Edward Little as well in Auburn. But I cannot get a response from South Portland or Freeport or Yarmouth. You know, it's just kind of funny. It just depends on who gets grabbed by it. And
Have
who's
you tried
willing to-
Lincoln Academy?
I haven't tried Lincoln Academy.
Give it a
That's
shot.
That's on my list, yeah. Yeah, okay, good. Yeah, I definitely come up for that.
Have you ever gone through the school committees?
School boards, you mean? Yeah, that's an interesting thought. No, I haven't. I should look into that.
My legislator who devoted against the AR is on my school committee.
Really? Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's what I'm always got a little bit worried about, especially the more rural areas, you know, like that guy from Oxford.
We were talking about her earlier.
Oh my God. I mean, they're talking about dinosaurs flying around out west. That's
You
deranged.
don't believe that? Thank you all for coming, this has been
Yeah.
wonderful. I should tell you also that the next chance is Tuesday.